Hello, everyone. My name is Amit Baran, and I will be your host for this event. On behalf of the IDI, we welcome you to our first launching event. More than that, we are delighted to share this exciting moment and provide a special welcome to our main speaker for today, Mr. Nadav Tamir. We are very excited and overwhelmed to see the tremendous hype around diplomacy among students around the world. I would like to start by providing a short overview of the organization and present to you our team and board members. With us today is IDI's President, Tal Zellinger, our three Vice Presidents, Nir Kaufman, Shir Madmoni, and Ido Tamir, our German representatives, Dominique Fielberg, Kevin Schweinberg, and Nicholas Bullbrand, and our special advisor, Trenton Mersholak and Tal Dvir. Our staff member, Stav Schnarch and Eden Ressler. The International Diplomacy Initiative is a student-run nonprofit dedicated to advancing diplomacy around the world through engaging practitioners with students through lectures and other events. The organization was founded in Israel, and we are looking to open new chapters around the world. With a new chapter already formed in Germany and with representatives around the world. Please visit our website to learn more about the organization, how becoming a member, or learn more about how to get involved with our team, and maybe start your own chapter in your country. I would like to welcome now the President, Mr. Tal Zellinger, for his opening statement. Tal,
Thank you.
the stage is yours.
Thank you, Amit, our representative in the US. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here today. Now, I will introduce myself. My name is Tal Zellinger. I live in Israel, and I'm a student of law and political science at IDC Herzliya, and the president of the International Diplomacy Initiative. And I'm very happy to see you all here at our first event. First of all, I want to thank our board members, staff, and global representatives for the effort they put to make this event happen. I want to especially thank Mr. Nadav Tamir for being with us today and giving us this lecture. In this diverging world, what we have is each other. What we gained from this horrible pandemic is the understanding that we can be closer than ever through the digital world. No, it isn't a replacement for the real world. Nothing can be compared to seeing you all in person. But we need to do our best at this time, as people, as humanity. This is the idea of IDI, bringing people together around our passion to diplomacy from everywhere on our planet. I hope to see you all again at our next online lecture or seeing you taking part at our local chapters. Stay safe. Amit, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Tal, for your kind words. The Israeli-US relationship has seen many ups and downs, but the alliance remains stronger than ever. Will it stay the same? Will it change with Biden in the office? I would like to welcome our main speaker for today, Mr. Nadav Tamir. Tamir is a former Israeli diplomat. He is currently J Street Israel's new executive director and a senior advisor for governmental and international affairs in the Peter Center of Peace. Mr. Tamir, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Tal. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's quite remarkable. Usually students are busy doing their courses, getting their credits, and are not that into initiatives that are not required by the curriculum. So to see students that want to do things to educate themselves and to influence and impact, it's really refreshing. And as a former diplomat, I think it is great because diplomacy, unlike in the past, is not just a top-down kind of skill. It's a bottom-up and students like you can do a lot for diplomacy, for Israel, for other countries, without even being the official representative of the government. So I'm very happy to be here, and I want to give you full credit for this initiative. I will tell you a little bit about myself, and then that will take us to the, to the topic at hand. So I got into diplomacy because I studied philosophy and political science in Hebrew University for my bachelor degree. All my life, even before then, I was very interested in international affairs and politics. But actually, in Hebrew University, I learned that one of the only things that you could do with my degree is to go to the foreign ministry, which sounded to me like a very attractive thing to do. So I did apply, and I went through the different stages of the process to get in, which at the time, and I think it still is the case, there were a lot more people who wanted to get in than those who really made it to the end. And when you cross one obstacle to another, it's starting being even more attractive. And I almost got in, but then my wife was accepted to do her master's at Columbia. So we went to New York for 2.5 years, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to actually go to diplomacy, because I was pretty worried about what does it mean for my kids. I heard a lot about those kids of diplomats that feel not connected to the countries that they belong to, and so I did some research. I actually I spoke with a lot of children of diplomats, and I learned that when the family was tight and close and warm and supportive, and when the spouse, who was not a diplomat, did not feel that they sacrificed their career for the diplomat, then actually the experience for the kids was mostly positive, and actually they learn about the world, and they don't feel unconnected. And when there are problems in the family, usually it's only getting worse because of the back and forth, going abroad, coming back. So I decided to go in, and we can test it. I mean, we have one of my kids here, so you could check if if it was a successful idea or not for me to join the foreign ministry. When I started my cadet course, it was actually parallel to the days of the Oslo Accords and the great breakthrough for Israeli diplomacy. And when I finished the course, I was sent to the office of the foreign minister at the time, Shimon Peres, who led the Oslo Accords, and his deputy foreign minister, Yossi Beilin, who actually was involved in the track 2 negotiation that led to the official track in Oslo. And I felt that I won the lottery, that I have the best job in the world, because all the opportunities looked kind of open because of this process. It was the first time in Israel's history, and probably the last, I hope not forever, but until now, that the foreign ministry was actually leading on core issues and leading this process and coordinating all the other players, security, treasury, and others. So it was really a great start to my career. But then things changed, as you know, those who know our history. Our Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated. Shimon Peres left the foreign ministry and went to be prime minister. I remained in the foreign minister's office with Ehud Barak, who came after a great career as a soldier, an officer, and eventually the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. And he came to be foreign minister. And I worked with him for 10 months. And then my friends who started the cadet course with me started to go to different exotic places around the globe, different embassies. And I actually was obsessed that I wanted to go to Washington. I was exposed to America in New York twice, once after my backpack tour in South America, like many Israelis do after their military service. and then later with my wife when she was doing her master's in Colombia. And I was very much interested to be in our most important capital in the world, in Washington. But usually you don't get to go to Washington in your first post. But I had some leverage being in the foreign minister's office, so I decided to wait until the opportunity will come. And then we had elections when Shimon Peres lost to Bibi Netanyahu, and David Levy came to be foreign minister. And only after this period, there was an opening in the embassy in Washington, and I was sent to Washington in '97. And I was there for 4 years, following American foreign policy in different parts of the world, not the Middle East. There was a more senior diplomat who followed the Middle East affairs. There was another diplomat who those of you in IDC knows, Ron Posor, who was doing the more PM strategic issues. And I was the most junior, but I learned so much. I learned, about US relations with Europe, with Asia, with Latin America, international organizations. I was kind of representing the Israeli Foreign Ministry towards the State Department and the National Security Council when it came to our policies in other places, learning what they do and also trying to coordinate it, and also trying to tell the headquarters in Jerusalem what the Americans are trying to do, and try to convince them that we're not the center of the world and America has some other things to worry about, which was very hard. In 2001, we finished our 4 year in Washington and came back to Israel. It was exactly 1 month before 9/11 when we came back. And I don't know if it was divine intervention or karma or coincidence, depends what your faith is, but Shimon Peres was again foreign minister in the Sharon government. So I had another chance to work with him and to enjoy his philosophy about diplomacy and leadership, which I could speak for hours about, but I know that's not why you invited me. And then from his Director General, Avi Gil, I heard about this amazing program, the Wexner program that brings every year 10 years from the public sector in Israel to the Kennedy School of Government of Harvard to study, to do a master's in administration. And I loved it. It's an amazing school. So I applied and I got in. And we spent 1 year living in Brookline, Massachusetts, and studying in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the Kennedy School of Government. And I took amazing courses about negotiations and leadership and you name it. And I learned so much also about my issues as a diplomat. For example, my whole attitude about public diplomacy and how to speak up, about Israel in campuses and otherwise completely changed in that year. My whole attitude towards Israel and the diaspora, how to do the connections right, changed completely. And I also learned a lot about management and how to manage in the public sector. After this year, I came back to Israel. I worked with Ron Posor, who was Director General, as he's trying to do together to reform the foreign ministry. And also I was kind of the expert on the US politics and foreign policy. And then we decided as a family that we want to go to abroad again, to another diplomatic tour. And my wife told me we're only going to a place that we've been already. And we're not starting from scratch. Moving the kids back and forth, it's not easy. So she said, we're going to a place that we already know. So that meant either Washington or New York or Boston. And Boston was the only place where I could actually apply to be the head of the mission. And I thought this is my time to lead a mission and not just to work in a mission. So I applied to Boston. I didn't think that I have a lot of chances because I was the most junior on the list of candidates. But with the support of Ron Posor as Director General, I actually had a better chance. But then Ron Posor left, government changed in Israel. There was another Director General who came with Tzipi Livni as Foreign Minister. And eventually, Tzipi Livni supported me in the committee. And I did get to Boston to be Consul General to New England. I was actually the Israeli ambassador to 5 American states. You know, usually we refer to New England as 6 states, but back then Connecticut was under the occupation of the New York consulate, and I only had 5, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And it was unbelievable time because I was able in Boston to really implement all those lessons that I learned as a student, and all the things that I also tried to reform the foreign ministry, working with Ron Prosor in my own shop in the consulate in Boston. And it was also amazing when there was a change in American administration, because the Obama administration really relied on Boston as an intellectual hub. Most of the influence came from Harvard, where he went to school, and a lot of the donors came from Boston. So I was able to play a role towards Washington in some ways more than the ambassador in Washington. I remember that I made some connection to him with the Obama administration for my post in Boston. And many other things that we don't have time to speak about. It was just unbelievable period of time. In my last year in Boston, I got into a problem, a conflict with the foreign ministry, because I wrote a cable. It was right after there was a change in Israeli politics, and the Netanyahu government was replacing the Olmert government, and the foreign minister Lieberman replaced Tzipi Livni. And I wrote a cable, or that's how we call memos in the foreign ministry, a cable, explaining why I think that the Netanyahu government is not dealing in the right way with the Obama administration, explaining why, because the US is our most important ally and the most important world power. Even if we have disagreements, we have to find a constructive way to work with them, and also try to explain what the Obama administration was trying to do in the Middle East, which I felt that was not completely understood in Israel. This cable was leaked to the press, and it became a big media event, and I was really accused especially by the Prime Minister's office, as if I have political reasons to leak the cable, and that I was trying to hurt them politically. I was summoned back to Israel for a hearing, and that kind of led me to understand that, you know, maybe I'm too opinionated to be a diplomat, especially when the government is not exactly to my, you know, serving my values. And then when we finished our tour in Boston after 4 years, and I came back to Israel, it was quite clear that I'm not getting any plum position in the foreign ministry. And indeed, I was sitting in policy planning, writing papers that went mostly to the trash because they were completely in the other direction of what the policymakers wanted to see. And then I got a call from the president's office. Shimon Peres was president, and his director general told me, you know, the diplomatic advisor is being opened. Why don't you apply? Because he knows you already. That could work well for us. And I applied, and I became the diplomatic advisor of President Peres for the last 3 years of the presidency, which was an unbelievable period of time, because as his diplomatic advisor, of course, all the doors in the world were open to him. So I got to meet all the world leaders in firsthand. You know, if there was a tete-a-tete meeting, what we call in Hebrew 4 eyes, between him and Obama, I was the note taker, or with Putin, or with Hollande, or Merkel, or Pope Francis, or President Xi from China. I got to see all of them and being, you know, kind of part of those amazing meetings, which was really the highlight for every diplomat. But then the presidency was over. Shimon Peres finished 7 years as president and 7 years in Israeli public life, and went to the Peres Center for Peace and Innovation to try to keep on implementing his vision outside government. And I understood that maybe I cannot really be an obedient civil servant for that government. So I took a leave of absence from government and came to serve at the Peres Center for Peace and Innovation. But by the way, the virtual background that you see behind me is from the balcony of the Peres Center for Peace and Innovation, which is based in Jaffa, and you see the Mediterranean around me. This is actually what you see It's an amazing place. I highly recommend it. Excuse me for using your stage for propaganda. I'm still there. After he left us in 2016, I kept on being a diplomatic advisor of the Peres Center, in touch with all the embassies and with the Israeli Foreign Ministry all over the world, Jewish organizations, think tanks, international organizations. And 3 months ago, I also started to be executive director of J Street, which lets me also follow my heart politically, because the Peres Center is not political. It's working with everybody, and J Street is very close to my heart politically, so I'm there. And now, after this long introduction, I'll get into the issues of the US-Israel relations. But I thought the introduction was important to explain my perspective, because when you speak to Israelis about any issue, you will probably hear from 2 people, 11 opinions. So it's very important to understand what is the perspective of the person you're hearing. So I don't want to hide anything. I'm a liberal Zionist who believe very much in the US-Israel relations, but from a certain perspective. Okay, going to the US-Israel relations, before I dive into the Biden administration and how it relates to the Netanyahu government or whoever will be our next prime minister, I want to kind of zoom out and speak about the US-Israel relations in kind of a wider perspective, because the US-Israel relations are much more than just who is leading. We always kind of, and the media are making it more simple, it's Netanyahu against Obama, or Netanyahu with Trump, or whatever, and what will happen with Biden. But there are structural issues that are much deeper than the personalities. And I want to explain them before I get into the more specifics. So first of all, when I try to explain to people what are the bases to the US-Israel relations, I usually like to divide it into 3, which is what we learned in the IDF, to separate everything into 3 to make it easier to understand. And I divide it into what I call VIP, which is values, interests, and politics. It's easier to understand the relations if you divide it this way. So I'll start with values. And first I will explain the deep relations before I actually get into the trends that are somewhat worrisome in my mind. But the deep relations between the 2 countries are based on fundamentals that are very much still in place, even though they are threatened. So in terms of values, the people who came to the US on the Mayflower, that there was a vote in the Mayflower, what's going to be the language of the new country, of the new place. And the English won by 1 vote. It could have been Hebrew, because the people who came to America, on that boat, we represented kind of people who left Britain in order to create a new place, who are very religious, and they are very connected to Israel as Protestants, Puritans. For them, America in many ways was the new Jerusalem on the hill, where they arrived to Cape Cod and later to Boston and all over the place. And they really felt that they're following the prophet of Judaism as part of their Christianity, and that the America that they create is very much similar to those values of the prophets of Israel. So this deep connection, those values of people who actually studied America, the Protestant values, were part of the story. I don't know if you know much about, those of you who are from there probably know, but unlike the Catholics, who are more based on the second testimony, the Protestants are very much also deep in the first testimony, which is also our Bible, the Jewish Bible, and they're much more connected to Israel in terms of their feeling that they're implementing, the First Testament in the way they live. And then later on, when modern Israel was established, the founder of Israel very much relied on the American, sorry, on the American Constitution and many of those values of creating a new place, a new society based on human rights, based on the rule of law, based on pluralism, based on social justice. Many of those things came from the American Constitution of modern Israel. So it was kind of two countries of immigrants. In the American case, immigrants who came to a new land and a new frontier, and in Israel, immigrants who came back to their homeland. But in those two cases, countries of immigrants taking over after British control. So there was a lot of feeling of connectedness between those American values of democracy and rule of law that connects US and Israel since then. So this is kind of the V of the values. Now I'm moving to the interest. For many years, the Middle East was very important to the US. And Israel, as an ally in the Middle East, was super an important interest for American foreign policy. The Middle East was important, of course, because of the fact that the energy resources of the US were here. And America very much used its foreign policy to protect the energy resources in the Middle East. In the Cold War, of course, it was how to keep the Middle East in the American hands and not the Soviet hands. And later on, when the end of the Cold War, it was also during the war on terror that the term that Bush coined, that where Israel was a very important ally. There was a story that at some point the Americans wanted to save Jordan from radical forces, and they asked Israel to use its power, which helped, and that showed the U.S. that Israel could be like an American base without using American soldiers, and it was, in many ways, when you think how many American soldiers are based in Korea or Japan or Germany. In the Middle East, in many cases, they didn't need to put those soldiers. Of course, they have a very huge base in Qatar and in Bahrain, but Israel was also part of the kind of strategic rationale of the US, this alliance, and there were also what they call prepositioning, American equipment that is based in Israel in order to be used if they need, and the Sixth Fleet was using Haifa as a base. So Israel, in terms of its interest, very, very much important as an ally to the US, an ally that doesn't ask for American soldiers to fight, but doing its own fight by getting the aid from the US. And this aid was not just philanthropy, because America gained a lot because Israel was actually using American weapons and American systems, and also helping America with R&D and with lessons from the ground. And then there was also all kind of mechanisms for intelligence sharing and joint exercises that were happening between the IDF and the Pentagon in so many fields. So values and interests. And now I move into politics. In terms of politics, the pro-Israeli forces in America were always very strong, even though the Jewish community is very small in numbers, around 2% of the US. But the political power was much bigger than this 2%. First of all, if you look, for example, on the donations to the two parties, in the Democratic Party, Jews give about more than half of the donations to the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party is a little less, but also very, very significant. Some of the biggest donors to both parties are Jews, and Jews were always very involved in politics, in the media, in campaigns. So the Jewish community was very, very much involved in American politics, and eventually AIPAC who is kind of a lobby for the U.S.-Israel relations, was considered for many years the most powerful lobby on foreign policy in Congress. Only the lobby for rifles is stronger, but it's not foreign policy; it's domestic. And when you add to that a phenomena that was not very political in the beginning, but now it's very much the evangelical Christians, you're talking about numbers, because there's close to 90 million Americans that consider themselves evangelical Christians, who for them support Israel is part of their religious duty, because according to their beliefs, in order for Jesus Christ to come back, Israel has to succeed. Eventually, the story is that there will be a big war in Armageddon because between the Bnei Or and Bnei Chosher, the forces of light and the forces of darkness, and then the forces of light will win, and that will bring Jesus back. For that, according to the scriptures that they strongly believe in, Israel has to succeed. By the way, as a diplomat, whenever I spoke to evangelical Christians, I used to tell them, I know there are many issues between you and the Jews in America who don't like your your theology and don't like the fact that you want all of us to become Christian when we found out that the Messiah came and is Jesus. But we as diplomats, we are more pragmatic people. So my decision is this. We will not decide right now what will be the end game after Armageddon. We will wait until the Messiah comes. And when the Messiah comes, we'll ask him, were you here before and your name is Jesus? Or are you here for the first time? If he says, I was Jesus, then we'll all become Christian. If he says the other way, you will all become Jews. Why argue about that now? Let's just cooperate. But to put that aside, the difference between the evangelical Christians and the Jewish community in terms of politics is that the evangelical Christians almost all is on the Republican side of the politics, while Jews were mostly in the Democrat side. Not all of them. I would say that 70% of the Jews are on the Democratic side. Those who on the Republican side are mostly the Orthodox Jews, and among the secular, it's mostly the Russian immigrants and the Israeli immigrants. Of course, it's all very generalizing, but this is the story that most secular or liberal denominations, Reform Conservative, are voting Democrats, and the evangelicals are all on the other side of the politics with the Orthodox Jews. But in any event, those two forces had very significant impact on American politics, as much as you could say that the relations with Israel are not only foreign policy, they're very much domestic policy, and they're very much part of the politics of America. So I explained the deep connection on the values, interests, and politics. And now I'll explain why some of those deep connections are now under threat. I'll start with values. Those values that connected US and Israel are very much changing. Because you could say that statistically, every new child that is born in America, most chances that this child will be liberal. You look at the demography in America, the liberals are getting stronger. America is no longer a country of the majority Protestant, white, Anglo-Saxon, what we used to call WASPs. It's a country of many new immigrants, Latin, Asians, others, who mostly don't vote for the Republicans. So, for example, Texas, who used to be a very much Republican state, because of the Latinos, is now 50-50 and will become soon a blue state. Will change the complete electoral college when you'll have the 39 representative of Texas on the other side. So the politics in America is changing. To give you a few other examples, if in the past ketchup, which is what the Basques really like to eat, was the most popular, now salsa of the Latinos is much more sold in America. In the American Supreme Court that has 9 judges, none of them is Protestant. 8 of them are Catholics and 2 are Jews. And before RBG passed away, it was 3 Jews and 6 6 Catholics. So there is a big change in America, also in terms of those, in terms of this demography. So while Israel is becoming more conservative because of the rate of birth of ultra-Orthodox and people on the right, in America it's exactly the opposite, and that's starting to create some changes in the connection of those values between the countries. When you move to the interest, if the Middle East used to be so important to America for so many years, it's no longer. America is almost completely independent in terms of energy. It's actually exporting energy rather than importing because of alternative energy, because of fracking, because of many things that happened. They don't rely on the Middle East oil and gas and energy resources as in the past. On top of that, all the American interventions in the Middle East were pretty much catastrophic. Going all the way in Iraq in the belief that you could create a democratic Middle East by force failed completely, and leading from behind in Libya didn't work as well. In those 2 countries, there were much more chaos after the American intervention than before, and in Syria, doing nothing did not work much as well. So there is a feeling in the US that there's no that they can't really build on the Middle East anymore, and there is nothing to build on. And there is a tendency to pivot to Asia because that is the most important. That's where the real strategic interest of America, the competition with China, the growing economies, and the Middle East. There is an interest to move out of the Middle East. I remember in the Obama administration, some people thought that this is just an Obama thing, but we saw that Trump, in many ways, also did not want a footprint in the Middle East, and the Biden administration as well. Of course, that doesn't mean that they leave completely, but they don't want to be as much invested in the Middle East and in the past. And that a very frightening thing for Israel, because for Israel, the Middle East without the US would be much, much tougher, because the vacuum that America leaves will be filled by forces that are where we don't have levers, when we don't have such a deep connection, whether it's with the Russians or the Iranians or the Turks and even the Chinese, if they decide to follow their economic interests also with real power. And now I'm getting into politics, and also in the politics, there is a big trend that is very worrisome. If in the past, the US-Israeli relations were very much bipartisan, and the mantra of all diplomats, me included, was we're doing everything possible to leave Israel from becoming a political football. We're trying to avoid Israel from becoming a wedge issue. We're working with both parties, and then it doesn't matter who is in the White House, who is in Congress, the support for Israel is not political. That changed completely, and Israel did become a wedge issue. When you look at the polls right now, you see that there is a big difference between conservatives and liberals in terms of how they define their connection to Israel and their support to Israel. And many people on the left, liberal, progressive, people who vote Democrat, were pretty much antagonized by the Netanyahu conflict with Obama, the fight over the Iran deal, and later on the symbiosis with Trump, that and even support to the Republicans, even before Trump, when Mitt Romney ran against Obama, there was a lot of help from the Israeli Prime Minister's office to help Mitt Romney, and later on to do whatever they can against Obama. And to say to whoever wants to hear that Trump is the best president for Israel. That doesn't sound very well to progressive and liberal ears, and didn't help Israel to become a bipartisan issue. So as I explained, the base for the relations is built on very important fundamentals, but those fundamentals are now at risk. And it's important to understand them before we get into the specifics of Biden and Trump and the relations between, what we predict would be the relations with the coming Biden administration. If we'll have some time, I will give you some of the ideas that I have to repair the problems between the two states. But first, I want to get into the description of the situation that Biden finds himself. So Biden, and I was able to be in many meetings between Biden and Peres. Actually, even when after the presidency, Biden came as a vice president to the Peres Center and paid a visit, and they were very close when Peres received the congressional award. Biden insisted that he will be the one to give it to him, and of course, he was also in the White House when Peres received the Liberty Award from Obama. Very close relations, and I know that Biden is very much pro-Israel from how they call it the kitschkes. I'm one of the only Israelis who believe that Obama was also a great friend of Israel, but in Obama's case, it was much more calculated. It was much more intellectual. For Biden, it's much more visceral. It's much more from the stomach. He really cares deeply about Israel. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that he sees what's good for America or what's good for Israel as the same as the governments that we have now. Most of the people that he nominated were people who tried very hard to get the agreement with Iran and the P5+1, the JCPOA, into action. Most of them remember how Netanyahu did whatever he can to derail that process and hurt the intimacy between the intelligence forces and others, because he used this information for the politics in America to work against the agreement. We remember even a visit by Biden to Israel as vice president, that in the day he arrived to Israel, there was an announcement of settlements in I forgot the name of this place in Jerusalem, and that created a really tough situation for him, and he had to delay the meeting with the Prime Minister Netanyahu. So there are many issues between the new Biden administration and Israel, but basically we're talking about people who are deeply connected to Israel. That's true also to Kamala Harris, who her record as senator is very much for Israel, and also as Attorney General. Even before she married a Jew, she was also always very, very supportive of Israel. But there is a feeling that that the agendas are very different, and even with all its support for Israel, for Biden, the two-state solution is what they see as the most important thing for Israel and the most important thing for America in the Middle East, and most important thing for America to be able to create a coalition of moderate forces against Iran, against Al-Qaeda, and they're going to pursue it, not immediately, because this administration is coming when its plate is very much full with other things. They have to first deal with COVID-19, which, as you know, in America is in a much tougher situation than it is here in Israel. We have an amazing health system, and the Americans still didn't figure out how to do medical insurance that covers everybody. With all the attempts of Obama, the Republicans are still trying to derail it. So it was much, much harder for America to deal with COVID-19. On top of that, Trump did whatever he could to avoid coordinating globally in terms of COVID, and Biden is exactly the opposite. One of his first decisions was to go back to the World Health Organization and to work with other countries The way Obama did it when Ebola, the Ebola pandemic started in Africa, and Obama administration created a global response, which actually stopped the pandemic before it reached Europe and the US. And it showed that, when you have global coordination, you could deal with the pandemics much better. So they have the pandemic, they have an economic crisis like every country has because of this pandemic that they have to deal with. They have the rift in America because among the 74 million who voted for Trump, as far as we know, 40% are still think that Trump won the elections and Biden stole the elections. So there are many internal issues that are not easy to deal with. And then you have other foreign priorities like China. Of course, Biden will deal with the Chinese issue differently than Trump, but there is a consensus in both parties that China is the biggest challenge to America, and that they have to deal with those relations in order to remain the superpower and to keep the kind of world as it is, the globalized world, will dealing with the Chinese situation. We have global, we have a climate change, which is a very important priority for Biden. We see that he put John Kerry, who was Secretary of State of Obama, as the czar of climate change, and he put in all the agencies people who deal with climate change, and there is a very big importance that the Biden administration gives to that. So, of course, Russia is a challenge. Very different relations between Biden and Russia, as we saw with Trump. An attempt to reestablish the relations with the allies in NATO and the allies in Asia that were really broken by the Trump administration. They have a lot before they even get to our issues. The one issue that is very much a priority in our region is Iran, because Iran is a ticking bomb. After Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, Iran got much, much closer to a bomb in terms of the amount of enriched uranium, around 12 times more enriched uranium than they had when the JCPOA was broken. Much more centrifuges, renewing the efforts of weaponizations and all kind of things. And of course, the monitoring is much, much weaker than it used to be. So there are many things that we don't even know. And for the Biden administration, Iran is a burning issue because Iran is getting closer to a bomb, but it's also a way to, through the JCPOA, to create back the coalition that was created by Obama, that where you have the Chinese, the Russians, the other members of the Security Council and Germany all together working together on this issue. Remind me when I'm supposed to finish my opening remarks?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Yeah, okay. So that's a very important issue, and again, this issue is going to be problematic because from what we heard from the Netanyahu government and from our ambassador and others, they don't like going back to the JCPOA. I know that many people, I think majority of the people who came out from the security different agencies believe that there is no way to stop Iran without diplomacy. But there are many arguments how to do it and what should be the conditions. So that's going to be a very tough issue between the Netanyahu or whoever is going to be elected here and the next Biden administration. And in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, what the Biden administration will try to do in the first period is just to reverse some of the things that Trump did, not everything, but definitely getting back the aid to the Palestinians, whether it's through US aid or UNRWA, and supporting other international programs getting back the representation in order to get back the consulate that deals with the Palestinians who are now part of the embassy in Jerusalem. They will need an Israeli approval, so they're waiting for the elections, but they will want to have a different representation to the Palestinians that is not part of the representation to Israel. They will also want to renew the Palestinian representation in Washington, which is not that easy because there is still an American law that American citizens could sue the Palestinians. And there is a lot of work behind the scenes in order for the Palestinians to adjust their policies to the American law in order to allow them to create a representation in Washington. And if they don't, they will probably have to use the UN representation, because in the UN there is immunity and nobody could sue them in New York. And there will also be a kind of reversal of the legitimacy of the settlements outside the blocks of Israel and some of the unilateral steps that were done by Israel even when the Trump administration was already lame duck after the elections. Pompeo did a lot for his campaign to become a leader, a president, or a senator from Kansas, while trying to implement a lot of what his evangelical Christian base wanted in some unilateral steps about legitimacy of the settlements and things like that, that the Biden administration will try to reverse. What they will not reverse is the fact that the embassy did and will stay in Jerusalem. But as I said, they will want to have a different representation to the Palestinians, which will eventually lead to another embassy in East Jerusalem if we will ever get to the two-state solution. And they're not going to reverse the Abrahamic Accords. They are going to treat some of the trade-offs that led to the Abrahamic Accords, whether it's the F-35s to the UAE or supporting the Morocco occupation of Western Sahara, or removing Sudan from the terror list. They will deal with those issues, but their intention is not to reverse the Abrahamic Accords, and they actually think that normalization is good for their policy in the Middle East, and they can build on that. They have a lot more leverage in terms of the Saudis, because the Saudis, who always relied on the US as their most important ally, are very worried because the Biden administration and the Democratic Party are very, very critical, especially of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince who is accused on the murder of Khashoggi in the consulate in Istanbul. And he is blamed for the fiasco in Yemen, where the Saudis are, there's a lot of suffering and very serious humanitarian issues in Yemen, and it doesn't seem that there's any solutions right there. So the Saudis are very worried. The Turks are very worried because Erdogan pretty much enjoyed friendship with Trump, but it's not going to be the same with Biden. So the Biden administration hold all kind of leverage that when they want to do something in the Middle East, they could do it, but it's not going to be a priority. And of course, they're going to wait to see what happened in the Israeli elections and also in the Palestinian elections. And right now, they're not taking a position. They didn't even nominate yet an assistant secretary for the Middle East. There are some rumors that Barbara Leaf from the NSC will become the assistant secretary, but it's not final, and they don't have ambassador in Israel yet. So right now, they're very much in organizational process, dealing with other things, domestic and international. But I think that we're going to see a very supportive Biden administration to Israel, but supportive in a kind of in a different. Of course, it depends what kind of government we will have. But if it will be still Netanyahu, we will see a Biden administration that supports Israel's security, support the bilateral relations, but very much different in its agenda towards Iran and the Palestinians than than the Netanyahu people were used to. if you ask me, what's good for Israel, of course, you will hear a very different answer than if you ask the Netanyahu people. And to be fair, also, if you ask most Israelis, but I think that Trump was disastrous for Israel, even though he's treated as the great president we ever had. I think that, as I said, the JCPOA made Iran much closer. I'm saying withdrawal from the JCPOA made Iran much closer to a bomb. I think the fact that they completely ignored the Palestinians and tried to do a peace agreement without the Palestinians is not good for Israel, because we need an American mediator who could work with both sides. The fact that America was not respected among the Europeans and other players is not good for Israel, because you want your most important ally to be able to bring the world and not to be isolated in its policies. And also, as I mentioned before, in terms of the politics, it really turned the Jewish community and created a big rift between the Jewish community and most of the Jewish community and Israel, who most Jews did not vote for Trump, and so his values are very different than theirs. And when they see that Trump and Netanyahu has this symbiosis, it's not helping to the connection between Israel and its most important diaspora, and also the basis of the Democratic Party. So I actually think that Biden is very good news for Israel. He's very much in the middle of the road. He's not part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and of course he's not a Republican. He's exactly what Israel needs at the moment. I want to say something about the claims that they're not going to deal with Israel at all because they're so busy with domestic issues. I want to remind all of us that Biden is the most experienced foreign policy president that America had since Bush the First. Bush the First was head of the CIA and ambassador in China before he became president. Since then, all of the presidents didn't have much foreign policy experience, but Biden is coming after years and years of being the chairman of the Senate Foreign Policy Committee, of 8 years of being a vice president under Obama and dealing a lot with foreign policy. He knows all the world leaders by name and with very good relations, and he also going to renew their interagency, the famous American ability to work with whole government that Trump pretty much destroyed. And that will allow him to deal with issues even if he is not involved in them day in and day out, because he will have the right people on the ground to deal with Israel, to deal with the Middle East, even if he still needs to deal with the other issues, including the domestic. So I think that the Israeli-U.S. relations needs a lot of repairing. And if you ask me who is the American politician among all the list of Democrats and Republicans that went in the primaries for the last elections, who is the person that can do it best? I believe it's Joe Biden, because he has this connection to Israel deep in his heart, but he has the criticism of what Trump did to the relations, and he has the ability to repair some of the damage that was done in the last decade to the U.S.-Israel relations. So I'll end here, and I'll be happy to address your questions.
Thank you, Nadav, for sharing with us your experience and knowledge. We would like to move on to the Q&A section. If you wish to ask a question, please do so by using the raise hand function. If you are unsure how to use it, please text us in the chat and we will guide you. When given the time to speak, feel free to unmute yourself and start by providing your name and country. Nadav, I will be asking you the first question. This was addressed by Martin and Eileen McKinnon. Please comment on the following. It was said by a former ambassador to Israel who said, Israel has a difficult decision to make. They have to decide which it will be, a Jewish state or a democracy, but they cannot be both. Can you please comment on that question?
Yeah, this remark is true if we won't find a way to create a two-state solution. If we won't be able to create a two-state solution eventually between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, the demography will force us to make this decision. Are we losing our identity as the homeland for the Jewish people and the only place in the world where Jews have sovereignty? Or are we giving up our democracy and not giving equal rights to, to the non-Jews in this country? And that will be a choice that will be the most painful choice. And for me, it's the end of Zionism, because Zionism for me is exactly being able to be both, to be a home for every Israeli, Jews and non-Jews alike, and on the same time to be the homeland of Jews all over the world. But if we will be able to have a two-state solution, then this sentence will be erased. So this sentence was, I think, was meant to say that Israel needs much more sense of urgency to help create the two-state solution. And it's very much up to Israel as the strong side in this conflict to be more proactive in getting it.
Thank you for your comment. Haidam, I see that you have raised your hand. You may unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's Idan, and thank you very much for sharing all the knowledge with us. It was a pleasure. And I want to ask you, if you mentioned before the US conflicts and the challenges with the Chinese administration. And do you think that the Israel-China relations might be affected in the future, and if they are already affected by the US position towards Xi's administration? And do you think if Biden have any stand in this conflict?
Yes, very much. Israel was forced to make tough choices, because the best thing for Israel is to have good relations with both. Of course, the U.S. is will always be the most important ally, but China represents a big opportunity for Israel. The Chinese are very enthusiastic about Israel innovation. I see it, when we don't have pandemic, I see a flood, of Chinese are coming to the Paris Center to learn about Israeli innovation. They see Israel as a great resource for them, and as a small country that is too small to be a big industry or a big market, the Chinese are a big opportunity for Israel. But while this conflict between the US and China is happening, many times Israel has to make choices. I believe that the Biden attitude toward China will be much more useful in this term, because the Trump administration just started a trade war. And in a trade war, it's a zero sum. You have to choose. Are you on this side or the other side? I think Biden will deal with the Chinese challenge differently. For example, to give you an idea what Obama tried to do with China, he promoted the TPP, the Trade Pacific Trade Agreement that was supposed to help the U.S. and its allies to be much more proactive in Asian economy. And one of the first decisions that Trump did was to take the US out of this trade agreement, which hurt America in terms of China. And the trade war, instead of hurting the Chinese, it hurts the American industry and the world industry. So trade wars are not good for neither. It's a lose-lose formula. And it also forces Israel to make a decision. But if Biden will be able to find a way to work with the Chinese to a more win-win formula where, we make the rules between us, but we are not going into a trade war, I think it will be easier for Israel to be friends with both and to enjoy also the advantages of the Chinese market and the Chinese industry.
Done? Okay, we will continue from here. Thank you for your response, Nadav. We have another question from Guy Deveris. Do you believe in the idea that it is the time for Israel to initiate major moves that will make Israel much more independent strategically and diplomatically speaking from the US?
I would say yes and no, and I will explain. On the one hand, of course, when the US is moving out of the Middle East, and I absolutely understand why the US wants to move out of the Middle East, Israel has to be able to be more independent and to have other alliances, especially with the more pro-Western countries in the region, which already is happening. By the way, it's not new. It didn't just start with the Abrahamic Accord. It's happening for many years, where many of the countries around us understood that Israel is not the major problem, but it could actually become part of the solution to their animosity with Iran, the solution to their animosity with the Sunni extremists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the solution to the development issues that they have. So they see a lot of fruits from becoming connected with Israel. Of course, the Palestinian issue is always and will remain an issue that stop the relations from really becoming full normalcy with all the region. But for Israel, those new relations are very much a part of the kind of replacement of just relying on the US. On the other hand, I do believe, and in this sense, not only in this sense, in many senses, I think differently than most of the defense establishment in Israel. I believe that Israel should go for a contractual alliance with the US, to have a real defense pact with the US, just like NATO have, just like Korea, Australia, and other countries have with the US. Because I believe that this will be a tool to help deter some of the forces against us, like Iran and others, and will also be will give America an incentive to help us achieve diplomatic agreement and also to decide our borders, because you can't have a defense pact without declaring what are your borders, what are you defending. So I actually believe that a defense pact with the US will help promote peace in the Middle East, and it could be a good tool. And in that sense, I would also think that what they call the aid for Israel should move from the State Department allocations or appropriations to the defense appropriations, and in that sense, it will not be seen as aid to a country that is an OECD member. It's not a developed country like Israel, but it will be seen as and will be a defense investment for the US. So Israel should, have relations with other players, especially in the Middle East, and not rely only on the US, but we should also find a way to work on our relations with the US that will be sustainable also when the US is less present in the Middle East.
Thank you, Guy, for the question. Thank you, Nadav, for your comment. Next question is from Sam. We would like to get your comments on Turkish-Israel relationship, Saudi-Israel relationship, and Egypt-Israel relationship.
Okay, so Turkey, for many years, in the early days when Israel, was very much in conflict with the Arab countries that we did not see the end of it. We remember the 3 no's of Khartoum, no recognition, no negotiation, no peace with Israel. Israel always looked to the periphery to have alliances with the non-Arab countries in the Middle East, and they including Turkey, Iran, and we see that now those countries that were the ally of Israel against the Arabs, now it's flipped. Now we have much better relations with the Arabs, and we have deteriorating relations with Iran and with Turkey. There are a lot of interest for Israel and Turkey to work together. There's a lot of strategic interest in doing things together. By the way, the trade relations were never hurt. There's a lot of trade and a lot of economy but the defense connection that we had and the intelligence connection were very much damaged since Erdogan came to power and decided that instead of trying to become part of Europe, he wants to be a superpower in the Middle East and be the voice of Muslims and also the protector of the Palestinian cause, partially because of his Islamist beliefs, but also in terms of he thought that this will make him much more popular in the region. It didn't work very well for Erdogan. Turkey now is much more isolated than ever before, and also the great success of the Turkish economy is no longer a great success, and the Turkish economy is now suffering. So I do believe that with other leadership, because now with Erdogan and Netanyahu, it's very hard to create a kind of a strategic relations like we had in the past. But I do believe that for Turkey and for Israel, it makes sense to have, because we have joint interest in the energy resources in the Mediterranean, especially the gas resources that Israel has, and Turkey wants to be the way for Europe of this gas. In terms of what's happening in Syria, it's important both for Israel and for Turkey that Syria will be stable. The Turks are very concerned about the Kurds in Syria, and Israel is concerned because of the pro-Iranian militias. Both countries want that Iran will not be as strong, and both countries are not that crazy about the Russian influence in Syria. So there are a lot of interests, but because of the leaders right now, Erdogan and Netanyahu, it's very hard to see how that will happen. It might happen if Biden will use its influence, but again, for that, he needs to deal with some issues before. In terms of Saudi Arabia, the Saudis is the big prize. If we're talking about continuation of the Abrahamic Accords, everybody is waiting for Saudi, because if Saudi is part of it, then it's a totally different ball game for Israel in terms of its relations with the region. But we have to remember that the Saudis were the one who came with the Saudi initiative that became the Arab Initiative, and for them to give up the support for a Palestinian cause, and for they need to see something happening on the ground. MBS, the Crown Prince, saw things differently. He had all kind of interest with the Trump administration, especially with Kushner, and he wanted to do other things. But now he's not as influential, and Biden is talking to his father and not to him, and he's trying to belittle his influence, also because of the pressure from the Democratic Party, who sees, many people who see MBS as a killer who killed Khashoggi and is responsible for the catastrophe in Yemen. We already saw the influence of the Biden election by the fact that Saudi Arabia went to this reconciliation with Qatar, and they have this kind of inter-Sunni rivalry between the Muslim Brotherhood, who Qatar and Turkey supports, and the other countries who think that the Muslim Brotherhood are a danger. And the Biden election actually created a new kind of relations between Saudi and Qatar, which brings the GCC countries kind of more back together. Not completely, of course, because they're still very angry about Al Jazeera, and they're still angry about some support for the Muslim Brotherhood, but much better relation. And it shows you that that Biden has the leverage. The Trump administration tried to take credit for that rift, but it was actually after the Trump visit to Saudi Arabia that the embargo on Qatar started, when MBS thought that he has the backing of the US and he could do whatever he wants, and this is now waning. So I believe that Saudi Arabia want to find a way to improve relations with Israel without being seen as deserting the Palestinian issue. And they didn't want to do it before, because they waited to the Biden administration. They understand they have to give Biden something in order to improve the relations. So Biden has this leverage, and I hope he will use it in a way that will help both normalization in the Middle East and promoting the two-state solution with the Palestinians. In terms of Egypt, Egypt is again one of the countries who feel losers because of the Biden win, because Trump didn't care a bit about human rights, and when the Democrats are back to power, they're going to press Egypt on democracy, on treating of NGOs and human rights. So the Egyptians are very worried how the Biden administration will treat them. But I believe that, the Egyptians eventually will, again, like the Saudis, they want good relations with the US. They want good relations with us because they rely on Israeli intelligence in Sinai. So if the Biden will play his cards right, I think we'll have improved relations with both Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey because of their own interests, not just because, but this leverage that Biden has could really help the Israeli relations with all the three countries that you mentioned. There is a rivalry between Egypt and Turkey also about the influence on the Palestinian issue. Egypt did not like the fact that the reconciliation talks between Hamas and Fatah happened in Istanbul. And since then, it did not go back to Istanbul. It was always in Cairo. But it also depends on what happened in the elections among the Palestinians. If the Egyptians will remain as influential as they were before, because Hamas might be a much more forceful force in these coming elections, and that will change the relations with Egypt, who sees Hamas as part of the Muslim Brotherhood that the Sisi administration very much works again and hates.
Thank you. Next question, Mr. Muhammad Al-Ktab, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, firstly, thank you very much. It's great information. So my name is Mohammed, I'm 20 and I'm from Israel. So my question, so do you think that a confederation state will be appropriate solution to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So depends what people mean when they say confederation, because if the confederation is based on the two states rationale, which means that there is two entities and they live in some kind of a confederate, just like you see in Europe, then absolutely. But I think that before we get a good marriage between Israel and Palestine, we need a good divorce. Because without having a clear separation and giving sovereignty to the Palestinians, the spoilers will use a confederation to just grab more land, and it will be very hard to have fruitful relations between the two entities. So if the confederation is kind of what will happen after a Palestinian state is being created, then I absolutely agree. But to think that it could happen before, I don't think. I think it will eventually lead to a one state. And for me, a one state is not a solution, it's a catastrophe. Because, we will have another Bosnia or another Beirut, because I don't see how, any side will give up their determination, and it will just be a very bloody process that eventually might risk also the identity of Israel.
Thank you, Muhammad. Next question is from Muhammad Yagi from Canada. By the end of Obama administration, second term is allowed the UNSC to pass a resolution against Israel's settlement in the West Bank. Do you see the Biden administration doing the same if a resolution against Israel's settlement present at the UNSC?
The Biden administration will try to create a situation where they don't have to vote in a way that is kind of seen as anti-Israeli. But there are definitely anti-settlements. So it depends how Israel will act. If Israel will work seriously towards curbing the settlements and towards a solution, then the Biden administration will not need to vote this way. The Obama administration voted for this resolution after being very frustrated that all their efforts led to nothing because Netanyahu just didn't play along. And I remember at those days, people used to tell me, what do I think about this kind of anti-Israeli resolution in the in the Security Council? And I said, I'm not aware of anti-Israeli resolution. I'm aware of anti-settlement resolution. And those are very different things, because the anti-settlement attitude of most European countries and most other countries in the world is not anti-Israeli. I think that it actually serves the interest of Israel, as I said, because it's the only way for Israel to remain what it is if we will curb the settlement development, especially those illegal posts. I do completely understand the deep connection of the settlers to those places, because if you read the Bible, you see that this is the cradle of the Jewish people. But in order to have a solution here, and in order to have our identity secured, the compromise has to be that we will remain our spiritual connection to some of those places that are the cradle of the Jewish people, like Jericho and Shiloh and Bethel, just like the Palestinians will keep on their spiritual connection to Jaffa and Haifa and Lid and Ramla, but the sovereignty will not be for us there and for them here. That's the only way to eventually end this predicament and to achieve a two-state solution. And that's why the settlement issue is not just about the connection of people to the territory, because human beings are more important than territory, and we need a solution to this conflict, and you cannot have it if you keep on settling and building all over the West Bank and ending the chances for the Palestinians to have their own states there. So if it will lead to that, the Biden administration will vote this way again, but they will try to do whatever they can to get us to some kind of a process where they don't have to vote this way.
Thank you. Next question is from Damon Bisol. How does Israel see the growing anti-Israel movement across Western university campuses? Does Israel see it as a challenge?
Yes, the biggest challenge for Israel in terms of is that more and more progressive and liberal people feel that that Israel is moving away from their values, and the way Israel deals with some of those efforts, like the BDS movement, for example, is working against a tactical issue, because BDS is tactical. It's not going to threaten Israel economy or Israel defense. But the way we treat it, while we call everybody who has criticism against us an anti-Semite, and we're actually pushing them to the hands of those who really want to harm us. So the only way to deal with the criticism and to deal with the questions about our policies is by engagement. Unfortunately, in many ways, you see that instead of engagement, you see calling them names, pushing them. Most of the people in the BDS movement, by the way, are not BDSniks. They don't want to end Israel. They are just there because this is the only way for them to voice their criticism. And if we will be able to separate between those who really want the end of Israel and those who just have criticism, whether we agree with it or not, that is the way to deal with this, with the campuses, and to remember that it's not about winning the debate; it's about winning hearts and minds. And hearts and minds, you do not win in a debate; you win in a dialogue. And we have to be much more open to criticism if we want to mend the rift that we have on some of those campuses.
Thank you. Next question, Adi. I saw you raise your hand. Adital, would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead?
I have a question. So basically, in the fight of Khaybar between Muhammad and the city of Mecca, he said the phrase of like having a peace agreement between Arabs and other nations will be only for 10 years. Can I ask it also in Hebrew?
No, I understand the question.
Okay, so what do you think about the relations with the Arab country nowadays? If in their basic belief, they only believe that the peace agreement is for 10 years, like what's going to be next? Is it like fake? Do they really believe in these agreements? Like how does it comes along with their belief?
First of all, believe me, I could find many sentences in our Bible that are very problematic. And secondly, you can't talk about all the Arabs as if it's one monolithic thing. There are, different Arabs just like there are different Jews. And I believe that most Arabs, they want the same things that we want. And it's true that in the early days, the Arab countries saw Israel as a foreign entity that was forced on them. But this is not the situation anymore. And you see that in every poll, even among Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians still believe in the two-state solution. So, it doesn't mean that they have to be Zionists or to accept our narrative, but it means that they understand that we're here to stay and they have to find a way to live with it. And I see, especially since the Arab Spring that was seen in Israel only as a kind of Islamic winter, but I see a lot more openness to Israel from people because the Arab world was opened up. Before then, there was control of the dictators on the media. People couldn't really know what's going on. But now that people have internets all over the place, they see the world, and those assumptions that we made on the Arabs that were based on what dictators said or the incitement of some leaders is not the case anymore. So I do believe in peace. I think that if you would ask the same question about, Germans think about French before the end of the war there, or if you ask this, you would have the same kind of people assuming that peace would never be possible. But I believe that peace is possible because it's it's what most people want. But they first want to feel that they're respected, that they have their own rights accepted. And I believe that there is a way to make sure that we all have our rights respected. And for that, we need compromise. We need to respect the other. We need to not, use broad colors to say that all the Arabs are this or all the Arabs are that, just like Jews. And believe me, there are many Palestinians who only saw settlers or soldiers in the passages, in the checkpoints, and they think this is Israel because this is all they saw. And when people meet with each other, they see the human side of the other. We see it in the Paris Center projects all the time. How when you bring people together, both sides see the human side. So it's not about what you could find in the Quran. And also there are very different interpretations of the Quran, just like there are very different interpretations of the Jewish scriptures. You could find people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich reading it one way, and the more liberal Jews reading it another way. So it's the same with the Quran and with the Islamic scriptures.
Thank you. Next question comes from Adi Segal. Mr. Tamir, you addressed the American retreat from the JCPOA as very problematic and what led to Iran becoming closer to the bomb. But on the long run, 2030, the agreement will come to end. What, in his opinion, will happen then, and how does you think the US government will deal with it?
So there's no doubt, and it's not just me saying it, it's the Biden people saying it, that we have to improve the agreement. the agreement, and Wendy Sherman just said it this week in her hearing in the Senate, that we need a longer and stronger agreement because the sunset provisions are not relevant anymore because the time that have passed. The reason why the Obama administration and the other P5+1 countries decided to go for it is that it was the best alternative at the moment. But everybody understands that it needs improvement, not just only of the term of the agreement, but also in terms of what do you do with the ballistic missiles, what do you do with the Iran using proxies in the Middle East. But the thought that if you only create more pressure on the Iranians, then eventually they will give up their nuclear program is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. With all the sanctions, the Iranians are proud people. And the people that are suffering are not the people that are close to the decision makers because, the Mishmarot HaMahapecha, the Revolutionary Guards, are not influenced by those sanctions as much as the people on the streets. In order to make a change in policy, you need a mechanism, and this mechanism is diplomacy. There's no other way. Sanctions on their own will not suffice, and definitely not when it's unilateral sanctions that are not an international effort like you had before. So I believe that what the Biden administration wants to do is, first of all, to go back to the old JCPOA in order to, as a beginning point, kind of a start. And then there will be the Iranian elections in June. Hopefully, the more moderate forces will win, and that allow for different rounds of negotiation to improve the agreement. And of course, it will be tough negotiations because the Iranians are very good negotiators. But it will serve the interest of both sides. So I wouldn't treat the JCPOA as just, as if it's the totally end game, but it's the beginning in order to improve it and in order to deal with other issues on the agenda with Iran. Because I don't see any way to stop the Iranian from breaking to a bomb without diplomacy and without the ability to for the international community to have some kind of a dialogue with them.
Next question comes from Ben Milo. As you mentioned, there currently exists the perception within the Israel public that is within Israel's interest to be supportive and well connected with key players in the Republican Party following President Trump's term. What would you recommend the Biden administration do in order to change this perception and prove to the Israeli public that the Democratic Party is an equal, if not better, and more capable ally?
Well, first of all, I think that we should go back to the old days when it wasn't about the politics, when the US relations were not either Republican or Democratic, when it was a bipartisan approach to Israel. But for me, when you look at the American president who really made a significant change in Israel strategic situation, you will see that it's presidents that were not that popular in Israel, unfortunately. So in order to be a great friend of Israel, you need to be able to have a combination of push and embrace. If you only embrace us, we take you for granted, just like Netanyahu took Clinton. If you only push us, you antagonize us. But if you do both, then you can achieve something. Just like Carter was able to use the opportunity that Sadat gave him to end the conflict between Israel and the most important and strongest and largest Arab country in the world, Egypt, that used to be our nemesis. And it was actually Bush, the father, not the son, with his very active foreign minister, Jim Baker, who was able to use the end of the Cold War and the first Gulf War in order to bring Israel to the Madrid talks against the will of Shamir, our prime minister at the time. And because of the Madrid talks, we eventually have diplomatic relations with China, with India, with many countries in the world, and eventually it also led to the Oslo process. So I believe that in order for Biden to be a real friend of Israel, he has to do both, to embrace us in terms of support for our security, in terms of the bilateral connection between our economies, but also to push us to do the right thing, because the Israeli politics is stuck. We cannot get out of this deadlock in the Israeli politics, and we need help of friends from abroad. Not to force on us, but to help us in using leadership to bring us to where we need to be in terms of mostly the Palestinian issue.
Next question, Mr. Fielberg, I see that you raised your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, you already mentioned in some way, but if you think there is an initiative like Obama did due to a two-state solution, to try and make a contract like Obama was trying to do between Palestine and Israel, do you think that this is something which is going to happen in some way?
I hope so. As I said, it's not a priority at the moment because there's so many other issues, but I hope that at some point it will, and I trust that it will, but only if we will, if we will get some order in the Israeli and Palestinian politics that will give the Biden administration something to work with. Obama started with a lot of enthusiasm. Is one of the first things that he did. He appointed George Mitchell, who brought the peace accords in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Accords, as his envoy to the peace process. But then he saw that the players on the ground are not very helpful, and he decided to move to other priorities. And he had a lot of issues internally to move. The medical, the Obamacare program and the Paris Accords and other things. And then Secretary Kerry was the one who said, I could deal with those players. I can deal with Netanyahu. Give me the backing and I will do it. And Obama said, listen, I don't think you can do it, but if you want, go ahead and try. And Kerry pretty much broke his neck by trying. So I think Biden learned the lesson that you shouldn't come with big expectations, but I'm sure that if the situation on the ground will give him the opportunities, he will use it, and he will use it very effectively because, as I said, he's very, very experienced in foreign policy, and he has very good people. We don't know yet who's going to be the ambassador and who's going to be the assistant secretary, but when I see Blinken and Sullivan and Sherman and Burns and Hadi Amr, I see very, very professional people on the key positions, and I believe that they will know how to do diplomacy in a very effective way once the opportunity comes. But it can't be only them. We have to also do the work here. And for that, we first have to wait to see the results of the election and to see if it is the last elections in this period, or because according to the polls, it seems that we're going to another round of elections, and that will make it very hard to go for any kind of an initiative while the politics here is so undecided.
So, Mr. Tamir, we have time for one more question. I would like to call for Nicholas Woolbrand to ask his question.
Yes, good evening. Greetings from Berlin, Germany. So I want to first thank you for your lecture. And my question would be, you know that Iran is entrenching in Syria. And at the same time, the US is retreating from the Middle East. You mentioned it, the pivot to Asia. And so what could be the best option for the US to support Israel facing Iran and Syria? Thank you.
So I believe that smart diplomacy can do a lot. I believe that America wants to retreat in terms of boots on the ground, but not necessarily in terms of diplomacy, because diplomacy is much cheaper and much more effective. In the history, big armies made the difference, but we saw what happened to the strongest military in the world, the Americans. in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. To use forces is not the best way to achieve your goals. You need your diplomacy to be backed by power, but diplomacy, smart diplomacy, should be the goal. And I believe that a smarter involvement of Biden in the future of Syria and in affecting Iran might also help Israel. First of all, if you take the nuclear threat, which is the highest priority because it's the most crucial, then I believe that Biden will be able to create a coalition of Middle Eastern countries that will be able to create some kind of detente with Iran and influence what's happening in Syria. Right now, we see that Syria's future is decided between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, and the US is completely not there. And I believe it will be different because Trump spoke a lot, but did very little in terms of Syria. He used 58 Tomahawk missiles, but that didn't change much. And I know that Obama was very much criticized for his Syria policy, but one of the reasons why in Israel today we don't have gas masks anymore is because of the agreement between Russia and the US to move most of the chemical weapons out of Syria. It's not everything, they still have chemical weapons, but significantly less, and that was achieved by smart diplomacy. I believe that smart diplomacy could change a lot. It will not solve everything, we will still have tensions, but I think that will help Israel a lot. Israel is stronger than it was ever when you compare it to the countries around us. But the real threats for Israel are first what I said about our identity and the Palestinian issue, but even from pure security issues, it's much more asymmetric threats, and it doesn't matter how strong you are, you need diplomacy in order to solve them.
Thank you. Mr. Tamir, as always, every time we get to hear you speak, it's a treat. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for coming. On behalf of the IDI, we would like to thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at our next online event or at our local chapter.